Hey, what's going on, guys? This is Late Night Hustle with Late Night Entertainment. Today I wanted to go over the computer that I've been using maybe for the past 3 or 4 months for editing and playing video games. But I wanted to go over the things that's in it and really why I built it and how I built it and how much money I spent on it. But let's get straight into it. I spent maybe close to $600 building it. But if you try to buy every single part brand new, it would probably cost you around $1,000. I don't suggest doing that, but if you want to, I mean, you could. But the way I did it, I bought everything secondhand, except for the RX480, but everything else was secondhand. So it came in really handy. Pretty much I found it on Facebook, but you could also find it on Craigslist. But the way I did it, I found it on Facebook just one day, just searching computers. And then all of a sudden, this guy, he had a computer up for sale for $350. I mean, it wasn't that bad for the price. I mean, it did have a lot of stuff that I need. But let's start off with the case. The case is a Fractal Design case, designed by Fractal Design, of course. It's probably $100 if you try to find it on Amazon. It's a pretty good case. It's just it's pretty tight, I guess you can say. There's not much space to work with, so an RX 480 barely fits in there. I bet an GTX 1080 would probably wouldn't fit in there. So that's why I put in an RX 480 that I already had from a system that I had before. When I first got the system, it came with a GTX 970, and I sold that and kept the money. But I put it in towards playing video games and buying video games, so I didn't really lose or spend any money. I mean, when I got it, it came with a EVGA 850 BQ power supply that cost $94 online. It's an 850 watt power supply, so it more than outdoes what I have it for. You can probably run two RX 480s off of it, and it's a semi-modular system, so it's a pretty good system, to be honest. For $94, you can't beat that price. Processor wise, it came with an i5 6400 quad core processor. It runs about $179 on eBay. You could probably find it for better prices depending on where you find, or depending on where you buy it from. And I did a couple of benchmarks on it. It did a 4313 in a single core and 12456 on the multi-core on Geekbench. So it's a pretty good quad core processor for the price. It does its job pretty well, and it's a true quad core processor. It's not a dual core processor with 4 threads. So this is a true quad core processor. GPU wise, I'm using an RX 480 that costs about $350, $300 on eBay. Depending on where you find it, same thing as the processor. It's a pretty good GPU for the price. I mean, by now the 580 came out, but the 480 it's pretty much the same card. You can't compare it to the RX Vega or the 1080, but you could compare it to the GTX 1060. They're pretty much neck and neck. Now, I've heard a few things, and I heard that if you run two RX 480s, in Crossfire, it could be as good as a 1080 Ti. I don't know if that's true. I'm still debating if I should try it or not. But that's a video for the future. That's another video for the next thing. Hard drive wise, I'm just using a 1TB 7200 RPM hard drive for $40. It came with an SSD, but it was only 120 gigabytes. So, I swapped that out for a 1TB hard drive. Motherboard, it came with a GAH110M motherboard. It's a pretty good motherboard. You can't overclock with it, but I heard you can also run Macintosh with it. You could run pretty much a form of Mac in it, a Hackintosh, I guess you can call it. It costs $70 online, so it's a pretty good price. So I did a couple benchmarks for you guys to show you guys really what it does and how well it does it. So let's get straight into it. Before we get into anything, I forgot to tell you guys that I'm using 16 gigabytes of DDR4 Vengeance RAM. It more than outperforms a lot of games nowadays. I guess with 8 gigabytes, you can get away with 8 gigabytes, but with 16, I mean, you just can't beat it. Now let's get straight into the benchmarks. Now on World War II, I was running everything on ultra settings, as you can see right here. on extra, so it runs it pretty well. I mean, the lowest I saw it go was maybe 58 frames per second to 60 frames per second, but it runs it pretty well. This is pretty much the smoothest game that I played today. It more than outperforms a lot of Xbox Ones or PS4s, so I'd be real happy with this game, and I would pick it up. If you make the system, I would really pick up this game. Next up, we play Fallout 4. It goes to the lower 40s and upper 60s whenever you go to Diamond City. I guess it's because it puts a lot of strain on the CPU and the GPU. But 95% of the time, it's running at 60 frames per second, so really there's no complaints here. Next up is GTA 5. As you can tell, I'm running everything on ultra settings, and everything's at pretty much the max settings, I guess you can say. It runs it pretty well, maybe dips here and there to the lower 50s, but overall it stays at 60, 95% of the time, same as Fallout 4, so it's a pretty enjoyable experience. Next up, we have PlayerUnknown Battlegrounds. It runs pretty well, I will say. Occasionally it will drop down to the 50s, but a lot of the times it's running at 60 frames per second. It looks pretty. It looks like a pretty game. It runs pretty well, so really there's no complaints here. The only thing I would really suggest is running this at 1080p. I wouldn't suggest running anything above 1080p, so just look out for that. Next up, we have Battlefield 1. This is where my system really, I don't know what's wrong with it. It hiccups every now and then, as you can see here in the video. Up in the left in the corner, it says it's running at 70, 80 frames per second, but really in game, there's a lot of hiccups. I guess it's because it's not really optimized for AMD cards. That's what I'm thinking. So the drivers really aren't optimized for this game, but it's still an enjoyable experience. You still have a lot of fun playing this game. I mean, it doesn't break anything, but I'll just be on the lookout for that. Now, as a side note, I wanted to tell you guys that I'm running everything at 1080p. Some games I ran at 720p only to get maybe 100 frames per second, but on these games I ran them at 1080p. I wouldn't suggest running this card at 4K or even at 1440p because it would pretty much cut your frames per second maybe in half. So unless you have a 1080 Ti or a 1080 GTX 1080, I don't suggest running at 4K. But really, thanks guys for watching, and it really means a lot that you like our videos, and hopefully we get bigger. Thanks for watching. See you guys later.